And configuration. Configuration is painful. Okay, so normally those two things, yeah, all the things up the configuration bullet are done by developers, yeah, to most extent, and the configuration is done by the normally done by other people. So these are some administrators or DevOps guys who are responsible for operations and deployment and all that less creative but more security critical, I would say, things. Yeah. So what is that? So this example of misconfiguration of SSL ciphers available, yeah, in the kit is probably a result of a misconfiguration. So someone just installed it by default, or I don't know, ticked the wrong boxes, or just left default credentials unchanged, and so on. So these all are results of configuration issues that should, of course, be verified, okay, on all levels, on platform levels, operating system levels as well. But web applications have their configurations too, and that's why configuration issues in terms of security arise all the time. So just Google for default password for that web application, for that CMS, you know, or try to brute force that, because it's like a web formed authentication that does not limit the failed login attempts rate. Okay, and as the bottom line of all that, what is going on every time we are trying to hack the system, and we succeed in that. If you think about each case in particular and try to generalize over all the cases, you will see that what has been done, what has been just done, is this trust abuse. Yeah, so the level of trust you have in the beginning and the level of permission you got in the end differs. So first of all, remember that case about the Tomcat credentials, yeah, default credentials in application server. Someone got into the network, yeah, so got trust of the organization to connect to its physical network, and abused that trust in order to get to where they shouldn't have access to. Okay, so it's all about trust in the end, and it's not just a philosophic concept. Yeah, so you can always assume that at some point it's always about trust, and our task is to see whether that trust is sufficiently verified. Okay, so trust but verify. This principle should be used everywhere and all the time, and our job is to check whether that was the case in this particular application. So whether the guys who had trust over configuration of the web application didn't fail that trust, yeah, and configured everything correctly. So let's go and see it. So in this way, framing your activities as trust verification, you will shape your activities much more efficiently. Just from my experience, I assure you that this mission of trust verification is much more productive and effective than just trying to hack around and cause havoc. Yeah, so that's the more positive attitude, and it is more efficient in methodological way. Okay, then let's become more specific already. So what are the types of attacks you can perform against web applications on the technology level? Yeah, on the level where the applications actually are built and operate. So of course, as I already mentioned, every more or less significant application that operates over some sensitive data or has some critical functionality has these AAA controls, yeah, authentication, authorization, and accountability. So what happens on that sector? Yeah, so first of all, very popular are just authentication bypass attacks. That's starting from SQL injection, authentication bypass, and straight up to this logical circumvention of certain steps that perform that authentication. So just getting through authentication mechanism by, I don't know, guessing the right password, or just circumventing the functionality of authentication altogether. Session hijacking means that someone has already successfully authenticated, yeah, and authorized against the application, and we just steal the session. Okay, this can be done in many ways. Cookie stealing is one example. What is vertical and horizontal escalation? So escalation of privileges is just getting something else or some more permissions than you are assigned to as a result of authentication and authorization. So it means that in a vertical sense, you just got higher, okay, so you just got administration account, for example, or some permissions you were not supposed to have. And horizontal means that you just got maybe the same level of permissions, but in a different context. For example, you got the data that is not yours. Okay, so you have an ability to perform the same operations as you can over your account, but over some other account, some other user's information and functionality. Okay. Cross-site request forgery is one example. Yeah, so let's say we can manipulate the user or technically arrange that the user that is successfully authenticated against the web application will issue an HTTP request, yeah, that we have specifically crafted. So for example, we just can somehow manipulate the data on the page in the context of this domain that gave a user a cookie, okay, and with this cookie, this user just sits on that page, but it's slightly different from the original, and it has this URL link in it, and the user clicks it, and there's a result. It's issuing an API call somewhere to some service that is getting that call and is presented with the cookie in the HTTP headers, and just behaves in the same manner as if that would be a legitimate API call by that authenticated user. And as a result of this API call, I don't know, some nasty things are happening, like money is transferred from this user account to our user account, for example, or the password is changed. Yeah, so some nasty things. Cookie stealing is an example of session hijacking is the situation when we do not manipulate the user to perform or automatically perform an action on their behalf, but the action that we craft, yeah. But we just steal the cookie. How it happens? We can for example XSS the browser and the web page, and like again issue the request to the server, to the web server we control, yeah, and just request a URL, a non-existent URL on that web server, and put the user's cookie, yeah, from the browser to the end of this URL. So in the log of the server we control, we will see what are the cookies for the user, and we can of course just copy that cookies to the local file, or just insert those cookies into the request in our Burp Suite proxy tool, and as a result have the same level of access to the web application as the user who we have stolen the cookie from. That of course can be protected against. The source control that I already mentioned is one way to do that, but yeah, that happens less frequently than you would imagine. Another class of attacks, I would say, is different types of injections. So here I just named a few of them, more on that on the next slide. XSS is not formally considered an injection, but in most cases we will inject scripting code somewhere. So in my imagination, it's still an injection attack, right? So what happens here? We are able somehow manipulate the functionality or conditions that affect the functionality of the web application. So for example, we can store a code in the database that is used to generate dynamic pages for other users, and we can store like the JavaScript code that will perform some nasty things like cookie stealing, for example. That would be called a stored XSS, stored cross-site scripting. We can inject SQL statements or manipulate the input in order to like tamper with SQL statements that are presumably run against the database on the server side. Yeah, and in this way, exfiltrate the data or even execute remote code on the back end. Okay, this is called SQL injection. We can like find by trial and error a point where a piece of input data is considered is then used to form a shell command, yeah, and in this way cause remote code execution of deliberate code chunk we download, yeah, in this way to the server side and then execute in the context of web server. Okay, we can find a local or remote file inclusion vulnerability that will just take a path we provide in some form, and that path being a URL to external resource or just full path or relative path to a local file in the server, will somehow bring it back to us. This can result in data disclosure for local file inclusion, for example, or code execution when we just can manipulate the application to take some code parts from external sources we carefully prepare beforehand. You see? So these are injections. We inject something. We put something into the application and see what happens until we change that input data to the form that results in something useful to us in a tech perspective. What is sensitive data leakage? That's basically what it's called. Yeah, so we have something that is not allowed to be accessed from the outside without authentication, and without proper authentication. Yeah, so it's available only for administrators, for example, and we somehow come to a situation when we can get that. Okay, so it can be like a result of an error, for example. Yeah, so just we have caused some unpleasant yeah event on the server side, and it resulted in some exception, and then the error message is just thrown to us, and we see what are the modules that failed and what are the full paths on the file system to them. That's not what we are intended to see there. Okay, so this can maybe not be very sensitive by its nature in the end, but it can let us mount other attacks. It can be a useful input to our attack modeling process. Okay. One of the very nasty example of sensitive data leakage is indirect object reference, insecure direct object reference. Sorry. So what it is just imagine that something is available by some random generated URL. Okay, and somehow we get this idea of how this random generated URL is actually generated, because nothing is random. Okay, everything is pseudo-random, and if we break this pseudo-randomization algorithm, we can get that. We can just, without any authentication or authorization, fuzz the path to the object, yeah, and by trial and error get that object. There were very, very bad things happening to some banks that just lost all their client databases in that way, and even some very private data of their clients, such as the scanned copies of their passports and other credentials. So that's what's happening all the time, because some people just think that that is not possible to infer or just observe from the application operations how it refers to the objects it's using in its internal logic implementation. Okay, so this assumption of that no one will get that secret path is wrong from the very beginning. And of course, misconfiguration abuse is also very popular. So with time, when you see a lot of examples of poorly configured systems, you will get the idea of what happens, what goes wrong, and in what cases. And even from the open source intelligence results, you will already have some hints. You will have some ideas of where to strike in order to get the most impact. Okay, so I don't know. There are different signs. High employee turnover in the operations department is one of them. Okay, so a lot of inexperienced staff who always oversimplify their operations and try to stick to these so-called standard passwords, that are very, very simple and known to everyone and passed on sticker notes and on the phone calls. So that's what it is basically.